None of these virtues, toleration, industriousness, or considerateness, is especially alluring or attractive. It's not a way of life. It's something one does. Full responsibility, however, has a certain allure or attraction, because when you truly mean to be responsible, when you understand your own freedom and your own self in the widest way, you take charge of more and more.
Mark, you argue that conserving liberty, which you think is the heart and soul of, and should be the heart and soul of modern conservatism, is not enough exactly, or it's more extensive than one might think. And so you go on to argue that conserving virtue is a necessary implication of conserving liberty. Is that where your argument for liberty would part company with a libertarian defense of liberty?
It's certainly one of the ways in which it parts company with it and moves in the direction of other kinds of conservatisms. It's sometimes argued that individual liberty automatically means a kind of a materialism, an interest simply in material things, and that there's no attention to character, excellence, virtue. I think that that's incorrect. And I think that a regime in which, a constitution in which, a way of life in which one means to foster and secure individual rights also depends on a certain set of virtues that individuals have. Otherwise, they won't succeed. Otherwise, they'll fail. Otherwise, all the things which one might have argued were done by aristocrats or guilds or others won't happen, because one must do them for oneself. And I think the chief among these virtues is responsibility. And that's why, in a way, that responsibility is first really highlighted as a virtue of individuals and, in a way, of institutions around the time of the period of the American founding. I think there's a necessary connection between the kind of character that you need in order to succeed with your individual rights and in order to protect your individual rights. And I also think that that character or quality of responsibility is important in governing itself. So all of that, I think, moves away, at least from certain understanding of libertarianism. I also don't think that libertarianism often has a strong understanding of the ground of liberty in individual natural rights. There are other kinds of arguments that you sometimes hear, which I think are less satisfactory.
Yes. Well, sometimes libertarianism, not in the best cases, but in many cases, is grounded in a kind of relativism where my choice is no better than your choice, and hence, our equality and our freedom is grounded on that very fact that we can't rank our ends or our purposes in life. But not all libertarians, and I think Charles Murray, the more intelligent and reasonable libertarians, are aware of that you can't ground liberty in relativism.
Yes, and you certainly can't, because it may be the case that my use of my liberty is very much satisfied by denying you the use of your liberty. Why is it that I should respect your liberty? There needs to be an argument which grounds individual liberty, and that argument, the argument of natural rights, indicates how it is that the individual liberties are something held equally, that natural rights are equal. Because when you look at yourself and see your own authority to choose and reflect and so on, there are no grounds on which you can really differentiate yourself from others in that respect.
And your book is very acute in insisting that you can't really ground all of this on a hypothesis, unlike the way Robert Nozick or other famous libertarian writers of the last century have tried to do. Your argument is you use quite deliberately the N-word, nature, that there's a reality under our rights, and that in the pursuit of them and in the exercise of them, liberty becomes a way of life, and a term that you use. And so when it becomes a way of life, then virtues, as it were, spring out of the pursuit of liberty or the arrangements of liberty itself.
The natural is what we don't make. The natural about anything is what covers it in some sense universally. The natural is what's essential about it as well. And all of that is an object of reason. One reason, by the way, that individual rights are the true grounds of conservatism, I think, is because they're observable by any human being, because they're observable reasonably. So I think you can make an argument about the naturalness of rights. When you think about that argument, however, you do see that certain virtues or qualities or character of soul need to be connected to those rights for them to be successfully executed and prosecuted. Hence responsibility, toleration, and so on. On the other hand, in political terms, a regime of natural rights does mean that most choices are acceptable as long as they are within the law. And one of the difficulties in conserving liberty is to somehow teach the ground on which you can choose wisely, and wisely means some understanding of better and worse, while also preserving natural equality. That's difficult. On the other hand, the root individual virtues, such as responsibility, are at some level at least open to all, not at the highest levels.
So, I mean, liberty, the kind of liberty we're talking about has these virtues attendant to it, which you describe. They're liberal virtues. They're not the old-fashioned virtues, either classical or Christian, I guess you could say. You name them as industriousness, toleration, niceness, or considerateness, as you call it, and then the one that you like best, I think it's clear, responsibility.
Yeah. It's not so much that I like it best, but it is that I think it's the most important.
But you also like it.
Yeah, but I like it too. None of these virtues, toleration, industriousness, or considerateness, is especially alluring or attractive. It's not a way of life. It's something one does. Full responsibility, however, has a certain allure or attraction, because when you truly mean to be responsible, when you understand your own freedom and your own self in the widest way, you take charge of more and more. You want to be the ground of more and more success and effectiveness, and that ultimately pushes in the direction of political responsibility. Now, so it's close, therefore, to ancient pride, though not the same.
Now, if conservatism ought to be prizing these virtues, and we ought to be somehow, as a political society, teaching them or inculcating them, what about the inconvenience you admit that there are other virtues outside these liberal virtues which we also seem to admire and need, even perhaps to some extent? How do you put these virtues together if you're going to teach them or inculcate them, since there are, as you emphasize, some tensions between the different accounts of virtue?
I think our virtues are all within the ambit of equal rights, and therefore something happens to the actual living out of even virtues such as moderation and courage. Nonetheless, it's perfectly reasonable to teach them exactly as they are. The more difficult virtues are indeed magnificence and magnanimity, greatness of soul, great pride. I think it's especially there that responsibility, when you really think it through, when you seek to be effective in your own sphere, and when you widen and widen that sphere so that it takes on public tasks, so that you are interested in the conditions of your happiness, so that in modern language you'd be the opposite, one might say, of a free rider. I think that kind of responsibility is the liberal democratic version, ultimately, of greatness of soul.
So does a statesman like Lincoln exhibit magnanimity, or is he only responsible?
Lincoln, Churchill, Washington, they're democratic statesmen. Their greatness of soul is closer to responsibility because it's within a situation of equality, when others are equally able to seek it, though they don't succeed within it. It's the exercise of virtue which is defending a certain kind of equality. So if one wants to argue that those figures would have been great-souled had they lived in the ancient world, perhaps so, but they didn't live in the ancient world, and therefore those qualities become qualities of responsibility. A way to say this is that responsibility needs to leave and does leave more room for others than true great pride, which tends ultimately to want to leave no room for anyone but oneself.
But I mean, the restraint of greatness is part of greatness too, and maybe not just in democratic circumstances, but in any political circumstance where the magnanimous man is surrounded by inferiors. I mean, does the ancient world have a greater statesman than a Lincoln or a Washington or a Churchill?
Right, so the ones who might be greater statesmen are the great founders and the great legislators, and about them we really don't know that much. In terms of the statesmen we actually know something about. It's hard to say that they're greater statesmen than our greatest statesmen, and especially our own founders. But I think you'd need to look at the founders in the ancient world to make an argument about greater statesmen even within the ancient world. That's why this virtue of responsibility can go quite far.